Alvaro, you may start now, please.
CBSI Connect system is one of our main regional projects under the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, which started in 2010 and was a recognition by the CARICOM states, the Dominican Republic and the United States, that we needed a joint approach to some of the security issues that we're facing in the Caribbean. So CBSI Connect was a way to promote law enforcement information sharing across the Caribbean region.
CBSI Connect allows each institution to act independently with its own independent portal site, but also replicate credentials to a shared site where collaboration and learning can take place among all participating institutions.
Through the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, we've started several regional programs, whether that's justice sector training, training on ballistics investigations, or law enforcement investigations training. And through CBSI Connect, these trainings can be broadcast to all member states.
Academies, agencies have been using it. We have had an increase in enrollment of participants for courses.
The knowledge that has been gained in the field, the knowledge that has been gained in the region can be shared, and that sharing and that collaboration is what makes this a very special asset moving forward for Caribbean law enforcement.
CBSI Connect users can either view our trainings at the academies themselves that are installed conference centers, or they can even use it at their laptop, on their laptops at home. And I believe we now also have mobile capability, so it is truly a training system that's accessible anywhere.
We have regular meetings with heads of academies. We meet regularly with agencies in the region. We get their input into courses and programs that are being offered on CBSI Connect.
Trafficking in people, trafficking in drugs, trafficking in money transcends the participating institutions in the region and truly becomes regional problems. The sharing of information, shedding sunlight, sharing expertise is a very important tool in combating these issues.
We've seen several positive impacts from the availability of training on CBSI Connect. One of them, of course, is a travel cost savings, because you no longer have to spend a day traveling and buy an expensive flight to go receive a training at another academy.
The training that has been done on CBSI Connect for law enforcement officers has had tremendous response. We have had an increase in enrollment of participants on CBSI Connect. We have had academies putting more courses on CBSI Connect. We have had training every month on CBSI Connect.
We encourage the use of the system for both internal training and external training, and we are trying to build out the library of available courses stored on the system, and we encourage our member states to upload their individual training which they want to share with the community.
If there are courses that are available that pique your interest, that could enhance your job, your ability to perform your duties as a professional over CBSI Connect, seek them out. Participate, engage. This is really the value of what this technology brings to the region.
And that has allowed different academies to build much stronger ties with each other and cooperate on shared law enforcement challenges in the region.
Stephen Kavanaugh, Executive Director, Police Services, Interpol. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Jones, Acting Executive Director, CARICOM IMPACS. Mr. Atlee Rodney, Commissioner of Police, Royal Police Force of Antigua and Barbuda. Mr. Leslie James, Commissioner of Police, Guyana Police Force. Mr. Trevor Botting, Commissioner of Police, Royal Turks and Caicos Islands Police Force. Mr. Colin John, Commissioner of Police, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the President of the Association of Caribbean Commissioners of Police, and Mr. Franklin Redhead, Deputy Commissioner of Police, Grenada. Good afternoon to everyone and welcome. I am Suzanne Sipasad, Regional Training Advisor for CBSI Connect. I hope that you all enjoyed our first session, and as we begin this second session, permit me to make special mention of all the commissioners of police and heads of police training academies who have been responsible for the success of CBSI Connect. For the CBSI Connect platform to remain relevant and useful for its purpose as an educational tool in the region, it has been imperative to have the support of the men and women who lead the law enforcement organizations in the various countries. During my tenure as training advisor, I've had the privilege to interact with many officers. Their enthusiasm and commitment to ensure that our law enforcement officers are the beneficiaries of training is highly commendable. I am confident that all the knowledge and skills that have been taught using CBSI Connect are reflected in the professionalism and execution of duties of those individuals who have taken the oath to protect and serve the citizenry. I'm happy to announce that CBSI Connect is being officially handed over to CARICOM IMPACS in order for the platform to continue in its role as an important educational tool for the region. I know that you will all continue to give your full cooperation and support to CARICOM IMPACS. It is my pleasure to welcome Lieutenant Colonel Michael Jones, who will be bringing remarks from CARICOM IMPACS.
Thank you, Suzanne. And I'd like to state that it is indeed our pleasure to be able to host this week-long conference entitled Securing Our Community Within the Era of COVID-19 and Beyond. Please allow me to give credit where it's due. This was the idea of a group of our technical staff, and upon their insistence and hard work, here we are today. It is indeed an honor to have the opportunity to lead such a distinguished group of employees, and please allow me to say thank you and congratulations to all of them. As we move into session 2, in preparing for this session, we recognize that police forces around the region would have had to integrate the traditional job expectations with new ones in some very trying circumstances. An unknown and unseen virus, which required drastic steps to secure the wider public interest, both from the policy and policing perspectives, have seen at times successes, challenges with a battle-weary and tired public, and at the same time, law enforcement was still expected to address the traditional threats and challenges such as illicit trafficking of narcotics and illegal weapons, human trafficking, to name a few. Questions such as how do we protect the forces, ensure that we maintain healthy personnel to undertake critical tasks without access to rapid testing and vaccines, where do we go from here, are just a few of the questions law enforcement leaders today would have to consider. I take the opportunity to welcome Commissioners Atlee Rodney from Antigua and Barbuda, Commissioner Leslie James from Guyana, Colin John from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who is also the president of the Association of Caribbean Commissioners of Police, Commissioner Trevor Botting from Turks and Caicos, and Deputy Commissioner Franklin Redhead from Grenada as part of the panel today. Gentlemen, thank all of you and welcome to you for your support for the agency and this conference. I must make special mention of our partners Interpol. Today, we are honored to have the Executive Director of Police Services, Mr. Stephen Kavanaugh. Sir, your presence here today is a testament of Interpol's commitment to the region. Before I fully hand over to Commissioner Rodney to moderate the session, I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker for this session. Although he could not be present for this session, the Interpol Secretary General, Mr. Jürgen Stock, would have sent a pre-recorded message. We wish to convey our sincere thanks to the Secretary General, Stock, for agreeing to do the keynote address, and we look forward to his speech, setting the tone for today's session. Without further delay, I would ask my technical staff at IMPACS to please commence the recording of the keynote address. Kerwan?
Excellencies, Executive Director of CARICOM IMPACS, Mr. Michael Jones, Commissioner of the Royal Police of Antigua and Barbuda, Mr. Adlai Rodney, distinguished Chiefs of Police, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor to have the opportunity to address this esteemed gathering under the auspices of the Implementation Agency for Crime and Security of the Caribbean Community. Thank you, Executive Director Michael Jones, for organizing this important event. Over the past month, the world has been learning to live with a new reality that COVID-19 has brought about. The essential role of police forces was expanded in most countries almost overnight, therefore emerging as critical enablers of national health contingency plans. The pandemic paralyzed many facets of our societies. Unfortunately, crime is not one of them. Since the onset of the crisis, Interpol national central bureaus across the world have been sharing intelligence on the new modus operandi the crisis called for. Criminal organizations had to circumvent travel restrictions, maintain illicit supply chains that risked costly disruption, and exploited a new environment that had brought a larger pool of potential victims and therefore bigger opportunities. In the Americas, we saw plantations of coca and cannabis shift to new areas, refined cocaine concealed in biomedical supplies, and marijuana smuggled in essential food containers and ambulances. Those same vehicles were reported as new means to smuggle migrants into the continent from as far as Asia and Africa across lockdowns. This very dynamism was especially evident in cyberspace. Societies across the world moved from the real world to the virtual world. For many, this meant entering uncharted territory in how business or human interactions were being conducted. That uncertainty once again turned into vulnerability. Online sites for the distribution of malicious software, ransomware, and phishing campaigns multiplied. Offers to provide information on the pandemic, personal protective equipment, or even miraculous cures became vectors to infect machines, obtain personal or bank details, and commit frauds. By their very nature, these crimes spare no region of the world, just like they can originate from any region of the world. That was the case when the first intrusion into the network of a private hospital in Curaçao was detected, and Interpol answered the call by providing immediate mitigation actions. Working alongside our partners over the course of the following month, the intrusion was successfully foiled, an imminent ransomware attack and likely shutdown of the hospital was averted. This is one snapshot of one threat targeting one of our 194 member countries on a given day. Indeed, transnational criminal threats were very much alive. This is the first fundamental lesson Interpol learned from this pandemic. The second lesson was that strong operational assets, innovation, and expertise can be readily converted into added value in a crisis. Interpol's first response in support of your police forces was to mobilize police capabilities and ensure full continuity of the I-24/7 Global Secure Communication Network, day and night, as the cornerstone of international police cooperation. This was possible by enabling 95% of our staff to work at home across the 12 countries hosting our infrastructure, 3 of which in the American continent, and granting uninterrupted service delivery to your police forces. In spite of the pandemic, the link between Interpol and CARICOM IMPACS through the Joint Regional Communication Center has remained live. Through this channel, CARICOM remains one of the largest generator of searches against our stolen and lost travel document database, having processed 33 million searches this year alone. During the health crisis, about 30 countries were assisted directly to maintain their international policing networks operational, while implementing contingency procedures, including in the Caribbean. In parallel, Our analytical work allowed police in countries that had succeeded in flattening the curve to share the operational lessons they had learned through the crisis so that colleagues abroad could move ahead of that curve. Our bioterrorism preparedness expertise was refocused to design global guidelines for the safety and effectiveness of law enforcement operators deployed into the field and thus most exposed to the risks of the pandemic. These have become a global standard reference for all first responders. Our video conferencing platform is also enabling information exchange, and operational coordination can still take place in spite of travel restrictions, connecting more than 22,000 participants worldwide per month. Finally, capacity building remained among our priorities through the pandemic with the launch of Interpol's Virtual Academy and Interpol's secure collaborative platform to facilitate online training and non-operational information exchange. However, despite the opportunities of innovation and of a hyper-connected world, we must still recognize a fundamental reality of policing. Field presence remains essential to detect, assess and respond to criminal threats. This will never change. That is why an important milestone for Interpol and law enforcement cooperation in this region will be the establishment of Interpol's first ever liaison office for the Caribbean located within CARICOM IMPACS in Barbados. I wish to express Interpol's full appreciation of the government of Barbados and of Her Excellency Prime Minister Mia Mottley for their support as we work together on turning this vision into reality. Excellencies, distinguished chiefs of police, ladies and gentlemen, the spread of the COVID-19 has been a major disruptor in our operational landscape, one that redefined national priorities, and one which called Interpol and CARICOM to respond and help defend the safety and security of our communities of the Caribbean. As many parts of the world are transitioning out of the acute stages of the crisis, the floodgates of international travel are starting to reopen, and with them, those of cross-border criminal flows. We must remain vigilant, and we must continue to coordinate police action across borders. Interpol is ready to work together with all of you to anticipate our common future, as well as the new threats and challenges that await us beyond the COVID-19 era. This will serve CARICOM's regional integration pillars, just like Interpol's vision for a safer world. We are bound by our objectives as we are by our common membership. Thank you. I wish you a very fruitful meeting.
There you would have heard some very inspiring words by the SG himself. And I also, Commissioner Rodney, would like to wish you and your team a good session at this point. I will hand over the proceedings to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Executive Director of IMPACS. Greetings to all my distinguished audience. I'm indeed honored to be your moderator for this session entitled Policing in a Time of Pandemic Lessons Learned. In a recent statement made by Ann Boulton, the Executive Chairman of Santander Bank, she said, and I quote, "One of the things in this crisis we have been trying to get across is to throw away the rule book. We have never seen this kind of crisis in our lives," end of quote. This advice comes from a financial expert. But for us in law enforcement, and in particular police organizations, we have faced and continue to face various types of crises. Some natural, some man-made, and some of unknown origin. We have been trained and cultured to respond and handle any and every event that confronts us. The question is, can we throw away the rule book when called upon to address the unknown? This afternoon we are here because in the early part of 2020, we heard a small whisper which rapidly turned into a very loud noise, and now we are face to face with a global health pandemic, which have law enforcement implications. Questions are, were we prepared to respond? How can our response be described? Did we have a rule book? And what are the implications for policing in our region and overall regional security? CARICOM Impacts has been creative to organize an event of this nature to examine the security of our community. We are all aware that the safety and security of this region is critical as we respond to this pandemic. This afternoon, to assist us, I am blessed to have a distinguished panel of experts, both regionally and internationally, to share with us lessons learned and the way forward. My illustrious audience, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel to you. First, representing the International Criminal Organization, Interpol, is Mr. Stephen Covenor. Stephen Covenor joined the Metropolitan Police in 1985, where he served in the Homicide Command and the Anti-Corruption Command. He was the staff officer to London Gold for the 7/7 bombings and the attempted bombings in 2005. Mr. Covenor has held a number of senior roles, including Commander Counterterrorism, Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Territorial Policing, where he was responsible for over 20,000 uniformed personnel and staff. He was selected for the role of Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Specialist Operations, New Scotland Yard, where he worked closely with the United Kingdom Home Office and other security partner bodies to transform the delivery of the Protect and Prepare counterterrorism stand for London. He received his Master's of Philosophy in Criminology from Wolfson College, Cambridge in 2002. In 2013, Mr. Covenor was appointed as the Chief Constable for his home county, Essex. There he guided his force through a period of austerity with a focus on unlocking workforce potential and transforming the operating culture and organizational IT infrastructure. His emphasis on collaborative partnership across Essex County partners, central government, and with his partner police force, Kent Police, and the Essex and Fire Rescue Service. And they delivered savings and efficiency while enhancing police capability. Mr. Covenor has contributed to broader UK policing through his membership of different bodies and collaboration with academia, government, industry, and the charitable sector. He was the chair of the Essex Criminal Justice Board. In November 2018, he retired as Chief Constable and became the Senior Policing Advisor to Accenture's Global Health and Public Safety team. He was also decorated with the Queen's Police Medal for his distinguished and contribution to policing in the United Kingdom. Earlier this year, in February 2020, he was appointed Executive Director Services at Interpol, in charge of 3 global crime programs, namely cybercrime, counterterrorism, and organized and emerging crime. Mr. Covenor is recognized as the 2nd highest ranking staff official after the Secretary General, which we just heard from. Also on our panel representing the northern section of our region is Mr. Trevor Buttin, Commissioner of Police of the Royal Turks and Caicos Police Force. Trevor Buttin was appointed as the Commissioner of Police for the Royal Turks and Caicos Island Police Force in July 2019. Prior to his appointment, he was the Deputy Commissioner for the said force, spending over 2 years in this role. In total, Commissioner Buttin has over 37 years of policing experience and has served as the Chief of Police for the British Overseas Territory of St. Helena, Ascension, and Trishan Dukuha for 3.5 years. He also served as senior police officer with over 30 years service with the Sussex Police Force in the United Kingdom. Over the years, he has gathered significant experience as a strategic and tactical police commander, and his last role in the UK being focused on crime and operation, leading in all aspects of crime operations and response to calls from the community. In his career, he has also worked in community policing, working as a local district commander. He has also gained experience at the airport policing and disaster management when he was the police commander for Gatwick Airport, one of the busiest runways in the world. In his role on St. Helena, Commissioner Bottin had responsibility for immigration, Her Majesty's Prison, fire and rescue, sea rescue, disaster management, and sea and rescue. As the Commissioner for Turks and Caicos Islands, he has been the leading force bringing organizational reform with the introduction of community policing coupled with significant staff development with a focus on leadership and diversity. Commissioner Bottin has led the force through a number of national crises and disasters, including 2 hurricanes and now the COVID-19 pandemic. On our panel today, representing the central part of the region, we have Mr. Colin John. Mr. John is the Commissioner of Police in the Royal Police Force of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and he joined that establishment some time ago in 1998, 16th of January. During his police career, he attended several training courses and worked in several sections, including beat and patrol, the immigration department, police canteen, police training school, the criminal investigation department, several outstations, and the narcotics section. He pursued studies and was awarded his LLB with honors from the University of Wales in February 2009. In that year, in the following year, 2010, he was called to the bar in London, and later he was called to the bar in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In 2011, he was transferred to the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions and appointed as the Assistant Director of Public Prosecution. He served in that position until 2016, when he returned to the force in the position of Deputy Commissioner of Police Acting. He was subsequently appointed to the position of Commissioner of Police, and presently he holds the position of President of the Association of Commissioners of Police in the region, ACCP. Also on our panel today, we are privileged to have from another the central section of the region also is Mr. Franklin Redhead, Deputy Commissioner of Police in the Royal Grenada Police Force. Deputy Commissioner Franklin Redhead has been in senior management for over 15 years. He has been the Deputy Commissioner for the past 11 years and is responsible for strategic oversight of administration, which encompasses professional standards and discipline, region, human resources, IT, finance, community relations, and the audit portfolios. He has held several senior executive positions within the Royal Grenada Police Force, and these include Operation Executive Officer, Commanding Officer, Coast Guard, Human Resource Development Coordinator, Project Development, and Implementation Officer. His distinguished career is because of his academic qualification, because he graduated from this United States Coast Guard Officer Cadet Program in 1987 and has successfully undergone several other training stints in the USA and the UK. Some of these include maritime law enforcement, territorial policing, counterterrorism, emergency management, leadership, and management in criminal investigation. His other professional development includes the Royal Navy Ship Command Program, and he has also successfully completed both junior and advanced staff colleges at the British Defense Academies, where he achieved his PSCJ certification. In the past, he served on a 2-year secondment at the Regional Security System headquarters in Barbados as a staff officer maritime operation, and later as an administrator and chief instructor at the Regional Security System Training Unit in Antigua. His academic achievements include 2 master's degrees, MBAs from University of Wales in UK, and a master's degree in defense studies from the University of London. He also possesses postgraduate diplomas in human resource management, information, communication, technology, project management, and has completed the Harvard MIT Advanced Negotiation Program. My distinguished audience, finally, we have representing the southern section of the region in the person of Mr. Leslie James, Commissioner of Guyana Police Force. Mr. Leslie James was enlisted in the Guyana Police Force in February 1987. He served in various capacities, including head of the Criminal Investigation Department, commander of A, C, and D divisions. Mr. James is a graduate of the Commonwealth Masters in Public Administration program. He's the holder of a Bachelor's of Law degree and a diploma in public management, all from the University of Guyana. His professional training includes gang prosecution and investigation, human resource development, source witness protection, human source management, among others. He is a national awardee in that he holds the Distinguished Discipline Service Star, DSS, and the Discipline Service Medal, DSM. Mr. James was appointed Commissioner of Police on August 30th, 2018. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of IMPACS, I extend a hearty welcome to my panelists and thank them for accepting to be part of this discussion. As we get into our discussion, I will now turn to each of my panelists to give a brief introduction of their perspective as leaders of law enforcement since the advent of the pandemic. And I will start from down south with Commissioner of Police, Mr. Leslie James. So Mr. James, we now call upon you to give a few opening remarks as to your perspective as a leader of a law enforcement agency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atlee Rodney, Commissioner of Police, and of course, our moderator for today's activity. I must say, first of all, that I'm very pleased to be identified with this program to do this presentation on policing in the time of a pandemic, lessons learned. And it's with a sense of duty that I'm here this afternoon to present. However, specific to my perspective is that as a leader of the police force that is the Guyana Police Force, which is a dynamic police force, it allowed me to engage in my many talents. That is to say, human resources, to treat with persons with humility, and to have a listening ear. I always urge my staff, my colleagues, even to the constables, for them to listen to the other side. As Commissioner of Police, the job, of course, can be challenging. Nevertheless, for the sake of the knowledge of my understanding of my mandate, I've been able to deliver in times that require me to deliver. I have a body of officers who themselves understand their respective mandates, and by such, we have been able to maintain law and order within the precincts of our country and, of course, at our border, and perhaps a little beyond. So with those comments, sir, I am very pleased to be part of this program today, representing the Ghana Police Force within this region. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much, Commissioner James. I'm now turning to Deputy Commissioner Redhead from Grenada. Ms. Franklin Redhead, could give us your opening remarks, please.
Good afternoon, my esteemed colleagues, and certainly good afternoon to the viewing and listening Caribbean public. I certainly want to join with previous speakers to certainly echo sentiments for the opportunity to be here, to certainly have a discussion on a very topical and important subject of coping within this challenging period that every country in the world is going through. From my perspective, as certainly being a top executive within the RGPF, I do not believe that the challenges that we have had during COVID are beyond the technical capability of the Royal Grenadian Police Force, or any police force for that matter, because enforcement is enforcement irrespective of context. The challenge for us has been the operational tempo in terms of satisfying the varying demands that are placed on us by varying stakeholders, adapting rather rapidly in terms of assessing what is happening on the ground, and trying to adapt so that we satisfy those broader, higher level strategic objectives that are placed on us by the state. So therefore the challenge was one of resourcing in terms of how do we make best with the finite resources that we have, both in terms of human capacity and also material capacity. I think that challenge requires some level of further discussion as we go forward, because I think we clearly understand now that as we transition through these various types of scenarios, how do we as a region, how do we individually as police forces make sense of our unique circumstances in the context of being able to do more with less, being able to adapt and to focus and have more precise application of policing principles and practices relative to those issues that requires us to do so. We know going forward what our reality is, how is that likely to change or evolve, and I don't anticipate in any significant way that we'll have rather revolutionary changes, but it will be more of an evolutionary process in terms of how we move forward. But as we transition from, I suppose, endemic, as I recall, and I'm searching for the right word here, epidemic to certainly pandemic to endemic, because from what I'm hearing and from what the science is suggesting, we will have to begin to live with these issues that are before us. So it will be interesting going forward in terms of how we frame that narrative in terms of living with this infection. How do we reframe policing actions and operations in the context that we have to operate within that space? Certainly from an individual perspective, and an institutional perspective, and certainly in the context of a national perspective. So all in all, it was a trying experience. It is still going to be a trying experience, challenging experience. I believe we have the wherewithal in terms of the technical capacity, because that has not changed. What requires a revisit and a rethink is really the resourcing issues. How can we maximize potential or spare capacity within state? How do we reorient police forces relative to ensuring that they can meet these mandates going forward in terms of curbing, in terms of satisfying those demands that are placed on us as institutions. So all of the things we have done in terms of operational adaptability, looking at our own in-house rules and processes in terms of our own protocols for minimizing and mitigating the infections, how do we control this going forward, are critically important discussions that we need to have certainly going forward. So this will be my opening salvo. And again, my colleagues to the Caribbean, thank you for being here, and certainly look forward to the lively debate that will ensue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Commissioner Redhead. And now I'll turn to Commissioner Colin John from St. Vincent and the Grenadines to give his opening remarks. So John, we are not hearing you. I don't know if you are, please make sure that your mic is on mute.
Yes, I said good afternoon, everyone, and to my distinguished colleagues, special good afternoon. Policing is perpetual, even in a pandemic. COVID-19 has presented us with several challenges as well as opportunities. From the perspective of St. Vincent and Grenadines, we have seen an increase in the type of duties that we have to perform, where we have to work along with the Ministry of Health and other agencies to help to maintain a healthy St. Vincent and Grenadines and Caribbean, and I must say. We had to work in enforcing that persons stay within the quarantine or stay in designated areas as prescribed by the Ministry of Health. This in itself brought about other challenges where police had to be especially tactful when performing these duties. These were not purely criminal offenses. These are persons who just want to go outside and they have to attack in order to properly police these quote-unquote offenses. We have also seen an increase in the report of unlawful sexual intercourse with girls under the age of 15 during this period, where because of schools were closed and children in some cases were left unsupervised, we saw an increase in that type of offenses. We also saw an increase in illegal entry from some Caribbean countries. That again brought about some additional challenges because the Coast Guard and the police, while intercepting them, they had to be cognizant of the fact that the COVID protocol had to be adhered to. So that brought about a different type of policing to St. Vincent and Grenadines, and I must say, the region. We have had some opportunities, however. We have had opportunity for increased training through virtual network or through the CBSI program or platform. We have seen an increased number of persons being trained because prior to COVID, where persons would physically go to a country, now it is done virtually, so more persons were given the opportunity to be trained. So that's another opportunity that was brought about. And another opportunity is the practical cooperation between different ministries in the country as well as different agencies internationally and regionally. So COVID has brought about its challenges, but it has brought about opportunities. It is my opinion that it will be with us for a long time. So we have to adapt our method of policing and make sure that at the end of the day, the region is safe, notwithstanding the fact that COVID may be present in the region. I look forward to the continued discussion. I look forward to being of further assistance and in my contribution to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Colin John. We now move to Turks and Caicos, Commissioner of Police Botin to make his opening remarks.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all my colleagues, and thank you for the invitation to participate today. I'd like to set out just the policing landscape here on the Turks and Caicos Islands as a start point. At the time of the pandemic, we were facing a rising crime, an influx of illegal migration, and a country where 86% of the GDP comes from tourism. Existing at the time as well, some rising community tensions, and in part that was due to the increasing number of migrants who travel here illegally. One of the key influencing factors in the territory's ability to respond to COVID-19 was a decision to invoke emergency powers, including shutting the borders very early, before, in fact, we'd had a positive case here. With that in mind, the insight I'd like to start with today falls into three broad areas: leadership, partnership, and finally, if we were to face a similar crisis again in the future, which I think we will be, what I and the team may do differently. So touching on leadership, the last year since my appointment has seen the building of a strong, consulted and unified force executive. So I had a ready-made and trusted top team to come together to design these strategic and operational objectives for the force. I saw one of my key roles as a commissioner was to turn ambiguity into clear direction. So as a commissioner, I was part of the group setting the country's response to COVID. And this enabled me to fully align the policing strategy to it, which helped make sure we're all working and pulling in the same direction. A key element of the setting of direction was making our leadership very visible. And officers on the front line had a member of the force executive out with them pretty much every single night of the last 3 to 4 months. And middle managers came out of their normal working day, normally spent in offices. So officers could see we stood with them and had a good understanding of the risks and feelings associated with frontline policing during the pandemic. Given our operational visibility, business continuity is important. So we split the force executive and other leadership areas in two, with the two groups operating independently from each other in terms of meeting. So some working from home and some in offices. And this gave us a contingency if members fell ill to give us some continuity of leadership for the force. Microsoft Teams was a new concept to us, but digital ways of keeping in contact and keeping in touch will now find themselves far more embedded in our strategic planning as a communication model for the future. One of the most persisting challenges has been policing the curfew. Emergency regulations early and aggressive curfew restrictions combined with limited resources means we were operating largely with public consent. And then that brings me to relationships. During the pandemic, we really did rely in the main on engagement with the public. There was no way we were going to arrest or prosecute our way to controlling the spread of COVID-19, and we did need to remind people of that sometimes. Engaging blogs and videos were key to reminding people of the guidelines in developing a more societal approach where breaking the rules, breaking the regulations was socially unacceptable. In the TCI, the governor, the premier and myself have worked hard and we enjoy a supportive relationship. And this showed its worth during this period. I was able to feed in thoughts on proposed regulations so Cabinet would have a view on how realistic they were to enforce. And partnership with other government agencies really added value through the appointment of 31 government employees as special constables, adding much needed capacity to our frontline operation. So whilst I'm broadly happy with the handling of the pandemic so far, there are of course things that I and we would have done differently. We didn't immediately take the opportunity for environmental scanning, which meant, for example, we were caught off guard by communities celebrating their National Day. We missed the opportunity to get some proactive communication out and to supplement officer numbers, and we won't miss that chance again, I'm sure. We should have also undertaken more rehearsals of what if things go wrong, tabletop exercises undertaken in the early stage of the crisis, such as police officers falling sick or persons in custody providing a positive test, would have given us a greater opportunity to spot these issues in advance. In effect, the planning needs to be as robust as it does for other disasters such as hurricane. The pandemic and impacts of the pandemic are of course not over. So pausing now to consider the lessons learned has been particularly useful as an exercise as we continue on this road. And I look forward to the discussions today to get the learning from other colleagues. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner from Turks and Caicos. And now we will turn to Stephen Covenant to give us an international perspective from where he sits as to his perspective as to what has been happening since the outbreak of this pandemic. Let's turn to Mr. Covenant.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner Rodney, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I suppose as a relatively newly appointed individual to Interpol, what has struck me was the depressing way that while lives have been taken at the early stage of the pandemic, criminals, both through organised and disorganised means, were looking to see how they could maximise their benefits, and whether that was fraud in terms of private scams, whether it was business email compromise, whether it was full sales of protective equipment, or whether it's a large-scale public fraud that took place. At the same time this was going on, we've already heard from the Secretary General about ransomware attacks. We heard about increased targeting of children by paedophiles who were spending time at home and online. And I found that a very sobering experience as somebody with some significant time in policing. What I was able to see was that as the pandemic moved globally, and this was my first time of being able to see this from a global perspective, was the different ways that economies, societies, and police forces tried to adapt in crisis. And I thought it was an interesting expression that was used earlier about throwing away the rule book. I've also heard the expression that imagination in these times of uncertainty is more important than process. And what we were trying to do within Interpol in those early stages was to make sure that we were able to share some of the learning that was going on as the pandemic moved across the world, not to preach to people or pretend that more was known, but to be able to be one of those agencies that shared. So what we saw was police organisations trying to manage all of these different issues. You had public order situations, you had community engagement that we've heard. We had transnational crime taking place. In different locations, police were involved in humanitarians sharing food and masks. They were being attacked at the same time with cyber disinformation programs, and the border management situation was placing increasing threats upon them. What we saw was that with stretched resource in many countries, public confidence changed in policing if the implementation of some of the measures that government wanted them to put in place was not managed appropriately, breakdowns in public confidence, in questioning of the role of policing, when actually policing was moving into the social welfare and healthing piece. What we've seen ultimately from an Interpol perspective is that the regional and global collaboration has never been more important. And whether that's the attempt at global fraud, the global child abuse issues, the global ransomware attacks, sharing these lessons quickly allows policing to work more effectively with government, more effectively with communities, and reduce the impact. And sadly, what we're seeing from a global perspective is spikes in the virus taking place, and certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, they're predicting now in the autumn and winter, increasing. So the ability to continue to share these lessons, the ability to be ready to adapt has never been more important. And looking at such an important region and listening to the lessons, I look forward to the rest of this meeting. Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner Rodney.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And at this time, we will look at some questions, and to the panelists, we want to maximize the time that we have available to us. So we'll be taking a few questions also from the audience. So persons can post their questions through YouTube, through the different platforms that they'll be using, and then we will try to entertain as much questions. So all I will ask of my panelists to have those questions, their response short and to the point. Let me start with Mr. John, using your legal background. What we observed during the pandemic, a number of protocols and different regulations was put into place. Our question this afternoon is, how adequate were those regulations, and on what are some of the challenges that law enforcement were first with in enforcing those regulations? So for instance, there's regulations with wearing of mask, social distancing, and so on. What is your assessment of those regulations and protocols that was put in place? And what are some of the challenges probably faced by law enforcement? Let me start with Mr. Colin John from St. Vincent with his legal background to assist us with that question.
Prior to this pandemic, the Public Health Act, if someone broke the quarantine, the maximum sentence was $150 or 3 months in prison. At the beginning of this, the first case was detected in St. Vincent and Grenadines, Parliament of St. Vincent and Grenadines went to court and changed the law. So it is now, I think it's $2,500 for each time you break the quarantine. And if you do it on a different day, then the penalty is given to you. We have not seen many cases of persons breaking the quarantine. Persons are generally cooperative. We have had a few cases. We have not taken anyone to court in St. Vincent and Grenadines as regard breaking the quarantine. There are a lot of public relations or public announcement as regard it, and persons generally adhere to the protocol that was set out by the Ministry of Health. From our standpoint as well, there were no mandatory regulation given as to wearing face masks. It was strongly recommended by the Ministry of Health, and persons, well, in most cases, adhere to it. From the police standpoint, however, during the height of the pandemic in St. Vincent and Grenadines, we did not grant any permission to play amplified music. There are a few business places who try to bend that rule a bit, but when the police turn up at their business places, they quickly turn off the music, and there was really no significant repeating of that type of activity. So to answer directly, we had to put legislation in place to adjust to the situation that we were facing at the time. And so far, it has worked relatively well.
Thank you very much, Mr. John. And when I come back to you, I want you to adjust your camera so we can get a better portrait of you. So ask your technical people to put you more in the screen, and there's also a background noise coming. I don't know if you have two different devices operating at the same time, so you can improve on that by the time we come back. Let me go up to the northern part of the Caribbean, and I think in his opening remarks, Commissioner Button, you mentioned of the different adjustments that had to be made, but I'm trying to get from you and maybe other commissioners, what kind of impact so far COVID have had on the workforce in terms of physically, emotionally, and maybe even professionally? What kind of impact have you been seeing on the men and women that have to do the policing responsibility since the COVID-19?
Thank you. Well, first and foremost, the force has really stepped up, and I am enormously proud of the way the force has dealt with it and how the men and women of the Royal Turks and Caicos Police Force have stepped up. Fundamentally, we are quite a tired bunch of people, as I'm sure that's reflected across a lot of the forces. So it's been hugely demanding against, as I said in my opening remarks, a backdrop of a rising crime. And we couldn't take our eye off the ball there. And also managing a fairly strict curfew, particularly the overnight curfew. So whilst it looks simple, staffing checkpoints and challenging people who are out and about, it was long and arduous. And then the crews here during the day, again, on the roadsides, challenging people as they moved around. So the force itself is tired and stretched. long hours on checkpoints, and long hours still chasing down criminality. But the thing that sits in the background that was most stark for me when I spoke to officers was concerns about, probably less about their own health, but obviously connected to the health of their family. Because we realised alongside our health colleagues that we were on the front line with COVID. We simply had to engage with the community. We simply had to go deep into the communities to deal with crime, to deal with victims of crime. So we did feel like we were right on that front line, and I think we were. So their own health and the health of their families became really important to them, and a major concern as we went through. And then you link that towards what we had was significant challenges around securing PPE. And I think that was probably a global issue with the demand that was placed, an enormous, unprecedented demand placed on PPE. So the concerns, the arduous workforce, or the arduous work that the team undertook was probably no different to post-hurricane, those other disasters, and they were skilled at it and experienced. But I think it was the personal safety which played a lot on officers' minds, and the safety of their family, realising they're on the front line of this. It certainly helped. I spoke about the visible leadership of the force. And from my perspective, and I think as a force executive, we've discussed this many times, I think it was greatly appreciated by the force. We didn't want to ask them to do something we weren't prepared to do ourselves. We obviously had our jobs to do. But understanding what was going on the ground, understanding the arduous tasks they were expected to undertake, really helped us in setting our strategic, but more significantly our operational objectives to the team. And just understanding, and during those nighttime moments sometimes, having those really important and valuable conversations with staff to really understand how they were feeling. So a lot of those concerns still exist, and we've been fortunate, blessed that we've not had large-scale sickness from COVID. In fact, we haven't had a member of the force test positive, and that's probably, I think, testament to some luck being looked after by whatever religion you believe in, but also I think we were very measured and clear about how we wanted to interact. So the force is tired, but certainly it's been an emotional journey for officers each day, having to make sure they kept themselves safe and therefore keep their families safe. So the impact, in all my nearly 38 years on policing, this was the biggest impact on officers' families that I've seen and those concerns.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Button. And we are thankful that you haven't had cases. Many of us can't say the same thing because some of us had to face the reality already. And following up on that, I want to turn to Deputy Commissioner Redhead. And by even on that point you just made, what are some of the measures that Grenada have in terms of for officers who might be unfortunately contaminated with this virus? What is in place in Grenada to address any contact with the COVID-19 by law enforcement? Help us understand what you have in Grenada, and probably that can also teach the others who have been unfortunately tested already.
Well, thank you, moderator, and certainly following on from the intervention of Commissioner Butting, our experiences is very similar in terms of the protracted hours of operations and the impact it has both physically and psychologically on officers across the board. It is something that we have contended over the last 10 years, and we seem to be going through these cycles of crises, if you will. And we are very much capable now in terms of our own mindset of dealing with these scenarios. Specific to COVID, what we have established very early in the piece is our protocols that will safeguard officers in terms of contracting the disease and controlling the disease if it gets to our space. Following on from the national strategic priorities that were set by government, we interpreted those edicts, if you will, and came up with a menu of different kinds of interventions that suited our environment relative to how do we interact with mass crowd events, protocols for persons coming into stations to make report, How do we treat with reports that are made from areas that have active or known infections? So there's quite a range of different protocols that address very specific issues with the expectation of how we will react to those situations and scenarios. So far, we have been very successful, and I must say, Grenada's stance on this issue is really one of control and mitigation. Control and mitigation, and we have adapted the same principles into our operational assumptions relative to all policing operations, both at the tactical level, the operational level, in terms of how that whole process pans out in actuality. So while we have not had any infections, we know, given the statistical probability, that if you don't have reported cases, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have cases. So our reactions still remain the same in terms of expectation going forward. And we behave as though there is still live infection. We encourage officers to have the protocols foremost in their minds. In fact, it has a primacy in terms of the way we conduct operations. There are protocols for persons coming to the station. There are protocols for officers going out on duties. How do we sanitize, physical assets, including vehicles, objects that we touch on a daily basis, from firearms to truncheons, the range and raft of policing equipment that you would encounter on a daily basis. There is a protocol for that, and we have tasked divisional commanders and certainly supervisors to make this a subject of importance in terms of the way they brief officers, the way they pay attention to these issues, because it is critically important that we minimize the potential threat and risk this poses for our police force. If we do not want this to decimate our police forces, because that has knock-on implications for everything else within the construct of Grenada in terms of enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Commissioner Redhead. Now, there's a question coming from online, which is very similar to a question I had, and I'm going to direct that to Commissioner James from Guyana. It's like, in this difficult time of this pandemic, how do we cope with industrial actions, protests, large gatherings, and at the same time protecting the human rights of the individuals in our community? How do we address that in this pandemic if we have to deal with large gatherings, any forms of protest, but at the same time safeguarding the human rights of the individuals? Mr. Leslie James.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. With regard to the issue of large gatherings and the conformity to human rights, we have an order which was given by our Minister of Health, and which outlined a number of measures which we enforce daily. While engaging with that enforcement, we maintain at all times human rights approaches. We respect our citizens, and while engaging with them, we maintain that position. That is to say, respecting their rights, their constitutional rights, that is. I can say to you too, we've had several interactions with a number of protesters, and during those, we've respected all of their rights during those engagements. I don't recall any significant report of any abuse of the right of any particular citizen. There might have been complaint of excesses, but not necessarily of abuse of that person's constitutional right.
So James, while you're still on, I have a question online coming specifically for you, and I would want you to just address it. And it is, what is, how the Guyana Police Force is managing the possible spread of COVID-19 at its borders with Brazil, Suriname, and Venezuela? That's a specific question to you, and I would ask you to just address that this time.
Yes, indeed, we do share common borders with those countries, and we have systems in place to mitigate against any contact with persons who are seeking to cross those borders. So matter of fact, at this present time, there are no movement across those borders. And our ranks are very close and they monitor daily any movement across those borders. When if it occurs, we will take action. Those persons will be taken to custody and they'll be placed into quarantine.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just move now back to Mr. Kavanagh from the Interpol. What are some of the challenges or the emerging crimes that we are seeing from a global perspective, but also can have regional implications? Based on where you sit, what are some of the emerging crimes? When we looked at, you know, some of the different discussions that we've been hearing, what are you seeing that can have a negative impact when it comes to crimes within this region?
Thank you very much. So what we're seeing is everything from a reduction in the reporting of burglaries, particularly home burglaries, less street robberies across significant member countries. But then what we have seen is significant spikes in particularly cybercrime. Both mentioned earlier, the attacks on infrastructure, including hospitals, the increased use of ransomware attacks, the use of the dark web to both purchase software that will enable these forms of malware to be placed on others' computers. What we're seeing at the same time is drug markets have been affected. Street markets are far more difficult to have their transactions. So some of those have moved on to the dark web. Purchases have taken place. And what we've seen globally is some of the mobile food delivery services being used as a front for either delivery of guns or delivery of drugs. More worryingly, what we've also seen is organized criminals utilizing the opportunity for their own means, and whether that's to buy businesses that are in trouble, whether it's to give loans initially at low rates, and then either putting the rates up or making other demands or taking over the business. We've seen organized criminals, some of the organized gangs, taking over the role in some deprived communities, providing food parcels and trying to ingratiate themselves with local communities. We've seen across the board, when families are locked up for protracted periods, an increase in domestic violence, often going unreported. And there are reports in some countries about increased sexual offending with friends and or relatives living in the home. So what we're trying to do is not anticipate everything going on, saying one model fits across the globe. We're saying there are some models that are increasingly useful and that other countries can share from. What we have seen is that the use of the Cyber Fusion Centre allows us to share quickly the opportunities for the threats that are emerging. We use the purple notices when we identify a crime trend that's taking place and share them with other countries to try and reduce the harm. But now the next stage of the crisis and the epidemic is what we've seen is drugs, illicit monies, and even people subject to human trafficking have been waiting for the release of some of the flights and transport networks. So what we are now seeing is pressure to move drugs across borders, pressure to move the money into those places that can have it properly laundered, online and offline. And we now need to be ready for those changes in the crime types as well. Some of those increasingly look like movement of firearms that have been waiting to be shipped for some time. These present us, we always talk about the criminals' opportunities. What we're saying now is also there's an opportunity for law enforcement to make the most of these emerging issues.
I was just going to ask you if you could just elaborate a little on that as to what are some of the things as regional leaders that we should be focusing on to address some of these new trends that are coming our way.
So the maximizing the utilization of Interpol data is increasingly important. We have the stolen lost document database, which helps us identify increasing levels of people trying to move human trafficking victims across borders. We've started sharing some of that data with people trying to establish bank accounts, and we're running a pilot with those opportunities at the moment. But whether it's the use of the purple notices, whether it's these type of meetings where different crime types are emerging, and myself and the Secretary General have spoken to police chiefs in South America, in Asia, in Africa, East Africa, West. And the interesting piece is particularly deprived communities where there is informal types of payment being made. The levels of deprivation, poverty is now pushing some of those poorer communities into crime types, and being ready for working with community leaders to identify where those pressures are is something that would be beneficial, because it's not those official people who in employment where tax takes place and everything else, it's those that are in informal employment that are receiving no benefit are beginning to now on occasions turn to crime, and it's about anticipating where that can take place and putting in measures to prevent that taking place in the first place. What we're seeing is the best of policing is getting better at using analysis, better at using data, better at using organizations like Interpol to anticipate what the next stage of this epidemic, a pandemic, will mean, and getting ready for it rather than reacting to it.
Okay, very good points, and points that we can take away after this seminar. Now let me turn back to Mr. John from St. Vincent. As Commissioner of St. Vincent, but also as the President of the Association of Commissioners of Police across the region, since the pandemic has been touching our grounds, what impact have you seen it have on our crime rate? What are you hearing from your other commissioners in terms of the crime rate? What significant impact it having on it since then? Mr. John?
Based on the information from the other commissioners, or most of them that is, they interact with, we have seen a decrease in crimes generally, but we have seen an increase in certain types of crimes, like the cyber type crimes. Persons are using the opportunity to try to access other persons' financial accounts and try to make themselves rich as a result of that. As I said before, we have seen an increase in sexual offenses. We have seen an increase in sexual offenses, especially child under the age of 15. We have also seen where criminals are using illegal means to enter the different countries to bring drugs or transshipment of drugs. So generally, the report is that there's a decrease in crime, but there's an increase in some specific types of crime.
That's it, John? I just lost you there. Okay, let me move to Commissioner Redhead. In your bio, one of the things that I see you have responsibility is for community policing. Now, what has been the impact on our relationship with the general public with all the new protocols that have been put into place? Has that have a negative impact, or what is the impact in terms of our public relations and having that interaction with the general public since the COVID-19?
Well, we will still like to believe that it is reasonable in terms of police-public relationship. Of course, this will vary from time to time based on the mood of the country, what is happening, and certainly the actions of the police itself, both collectively and individually. I think what has influenced that position is really what is happening in the wider dynamic of the global upsurge against, and certainly the call for enforcement reformation. So that has had some influence in terms of protests to a degree. And certainly it has an influence in terms of that dynamic between the RGPF and the public. But in the context of our policing strategy or community policing strategy per se, certainly COVID did not present an opportunity for us to expand this. We have several structures such as citizens advisory bodies, crime management teams, and other systems that we use as the fundamental pillars of our community policing strategy. And what COVID has done is prevent that from being amplified and being used in a sustainable way. But nevertheless, it's also an opportunity for us to reevaluate how we can make better use of these tools in a practical sense. Certainly from a philosophical perspective, they remain excellent in terms of progression. But what has to be relooked is how do we make and advance these issues relative to the restrictions and constraints that are currently before us. And certainly it is a discussion that is ongoing. We don't know how that is going to lead down the road, or where it's going to lead down the road, sorry. But it is important in the context of our policing strategies that we continue to build and sustain community policing as an integral component of our policing operations and profile. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me take a question from our audience, and I'm going to direct that question to Commissioner Botted. The question coming from our audience is saying COVID led to the use of virtual courts and early release from prison. What innovative policing strategy has been introduced as a result of COVID-19 that will likely continue post-pandemic? Basically, there has been some changes even from the courts, from the prison, but from our end, what new strategies that we can be innovated with that is likely to continue post-pandemic? And that's a very interesting question coming from members of our audience.
It is a very interesting question and very pertinent to Turks and Caicos. We are made up of 40 islands, 8 of which are inhabited, and 3 or 4 of those have courts on, for example. So the new Chief Justice here has had her work cut out in trying to get the courts moving, and communication across the islands is critical. So at the moment, we're looking at virtual courts across a number of locations across the islands. And I spoke in my introduction around the use of Microsoft Teams, and there's obviously other forums and platforms. And we've learned a lot, and there'll always be positives from experience. And one of the positives is how we interact as a force and how we interact with our partners and also with our community through digital platforms. And this, as I said at the start, will continue. It won't just be a COVID-related issue. We've always had challenges in keeping in contact with our policing teams on our sister islands, and this now has transformed, and it's been an eye-opener, and we're wondering why we've never done it before, in truth. For the courts, it's been a real challenge. We do have virtual courts now. It was a challenge for us during the pandemic when we did have to make arrests for breaches of the curfew, because if there's an area we collectively, the criminal justice stakeholders, could have done better, is better prepare ourselves for getting people through the courts, and particularly when there were COVID-related offences under the regulations. But we will continue to use Microsoft Teams and other platforms to communicate across our islands, and it's worked really, really effectively. In fact, we're having discussions now how we do this when we have potentially a reduced connectivity post-hurricane, because it has worked so effectively. I can see us relying on it, and then we'll have to think again when we lose that connectivity that often comes with that type of disaster. But we are now, we have the ability to talk hour to hour with our sister islands in a way we've never done before, and a more meaningful way. So all of our major meetings still continue on Microsoft Teams, and they will continue into the future, even post-COVID, although I think COVID will be with us for some time. So I would say the end result is we've communicated better post-COVID than we did before. So that is a real positive for us when we have policing across a number of islands. We've got policing on 5 or 6 islands that we have to keep in contact with. So the really strong positive for us as a force is that. And secondly, we're also examining a digital platform to wrap our community policing around. And it is an engagement platform which allows to and fro and updates to our community, which they can sign up for. So it's actually made us delve further into how we can use the digital platforms to communicate more effectively, day to day more effectively, and at all levels through the organization. So it feels sometimes COVID has not brought many positives, but certainly this has been one for us on the Turks and Caicos.
Thank you very much. And I think I want to direct that same question to Mr. Leslie James, having command of maybe one of the biggest force in the region. What are some of the new innovations that COVID has brought in that might remain with us for a while? Mr. James from Guyana.
Thank you again, Mr. Moderator. Certainly a pertinent question. What has happened since the COVID-19 came on? We have had to engage with other entities. We generally engage with the Ministry of Health. When we have to go into the interior, we engage with some other agencies. In terms of responding to this pandemic, we have a joint approach. At the moment, there is a national task force, a secretariat, and that task force would give guidelines in the approach to the various areas that might be deemed to have been heavily affected. So the Guyana Police Force would operate in a collaborative manner in dealing with this pandemic. We do not, or we will not be going it alone, but with a general response with other agencies on board. And it has certainly changed the way in which we have been doing things. Of course, the ranks would be outfitted with their personal protective equipment. And of course, after a period, they will be checked again to see whether or not they've been affected. So in terms of the way in which we do things, there have been a review in terms of our SOPs and so on. As you may know, the last time Guyana has been affected by such a pandemic, that is the Spanish flu, was in the 1990. I think it was 1918 to 1990, almost 1 century ago. And we have, of course, we have had to check to see what applicable laws might be able for us to apply to deal with persons who may be breaching those measures. And after those, the ordinance was put in place and the order given by the minister, we've embarked on a number of programs for us to educate the citizenry of the need to comply with the measures. We have also engaged them to remind them that should they fail to comply, they're likely to face charges. At first, I must be quite frank, there was some level of non-compliance, but with the passage of time, they've recognized the need for compliance. But to date, what I can say is that in a general way, the citizenry have realized that the pandemic is a real one and there is need for compliance. We are still having some issues in some quarters, but those are being dealt with. Persons are being charged and placed before the courts.
Okay, then thanks. And now I have a very interesting question coming from our audience, and I would like to direct that question to Mr. Kavanagh from Interpol. And the question is, has strategies been developed and resources allocated to address the threat posed by cyber criminals, given the increase in the use of cyber or digital platform by governments and citizens? Mr. Kavanagh?
Thank you. Yes, what we've recognised is that both in terms of the crime trends that have taken place and cyber encapsulates it. This is an era for policing in which we cannot solve these challenges on our own geographical borders. As I mentioned, this is why this regional type of meeting is so important, even beyond regions. We need to think now about where these people sit, where they are attacking various methodologies, and whether that's romance fraud, whether that's business email compromise, whether it's malware, ransomware. The opportunities, because we are working from home, we're using Zoom, we're using Microsoft Teams, we're using a whole range of software to try and enable people to be more effective. But what that means is whether it's commercial or policing, and we've seen it with health services being attacked, not just for ransomware, but also now for trying to establish exactly who may be further ahead in developing the vaccine. All of this means that sitting at home, individuals can one moment start laundering money, they can then online buy drugs, they can then peddle child abuse imagery, and then they can try hacking into somebody. To try and define individuals according to a single crime type in the cyber era is a mistake. And not only can policing not do it on its own, Interpol, even as a global organization, needs help. And we've got a Operation Gateway, which brings together major players in the private sector that help us identify the new and emerging threats that are on the cyber environment. And we are then able to push those out to forces, and we'd encourage the region to make sure that we use those. We have reorganized the way that we do cybercrime. Even in a time of reduction, I've had to put additional resource into the cybercrime teams to make sure that we're ready to respond, to make sure that we're ready to support individual forces, that we can identify when those threats are emerging, and we can reduce the harm that's taking place. And we've seen some very strong arrests taking place during this period as a result of Interpol working both with regions and national forces. So yes, my suggestion to everyone is that the moment we think we've nailed the cyber fraud or the cyber crimes, it will have moved on. So it will require all of us to work together more effectively than ever with the private sector, with different user communities. And every time we think we've got it, it will run away from us. That's okay, because that's the nature of the new threat. We will never, ever nail down cybercrime, because it will shift, and we need to be ready for that.
Thank you very much, Tim. I just want to have a next question there from our distinguished audience. And this question, I would want to direct this question to Deputy Commissioner Redhead. And the question is interagency cooperation and coordination. How would you describe the working relationship between the police and other law enforcement agencies? For example, the Customs, Immigration, Defense Force, those islands who have different force in the fight against crime during this pandemic. That's a question coming from the audience, and I'm directing that to Deputy Commissioner Redhead.
I think it's a pretty interesting question because I'm intrigued by the notion of how we can collaborate more effectively, both individually as country or with intra-country as well as intra-regional. And there is good functional cooperation along those lines, as the question was posed, between customs, immigration, and most of the institutionalized law enforcement entities that are currently existing within country. But I think the broader question is, though, given that we have now had this challenge, do we need new institutions? Do we reframe institutions along the lines of the threat that currently exists? I don't believe that we have had that discussion, that kind of scientific interrogation to see whether or not institutions are still fit for purpose. We still certainly walk along the lines of police having a specific mandate or customs having a specific mandate. But I think there's value in re-examining this construct in terms of looking at, can we reinvent, if you will, new institutions? Are the institutions currently existing? Are they fit for purpose? What can we shift? What can we change relative to how we can make our approach and response better in terms of the mechanisms that currently exist going forward relative to not only this crisis, but the future crisis in terms of how we individually as countries and collectively as a region can approach crises going forward.
And while you're on that same note, Deputy Commissioner Reddit, I have a follow-up question coming from the audience in terms of how do we expand that relationship with the Ministry of Health? Based on what has happened, how do you merge now the Ministry of Health with the Ministry of National Security as in collaborative effort, based on what we have experienced now from this pandemic?
It's a follow-on from my previous comment, because what I mean in terms of strategically, we have to sit and understand what is before us. You cannot segment problems by stovepipe, in stovepipes, if you will, and say that this is purely a policing issue, or this is purely a health issue, or this is purely a customs and excise issue. There has to be a reckoning that looks at the range of problem and problem sets. How do we now revisit what currently exists? Can we rejig that to be more fit for purpose? And while there's good cooperation between health and health lead and police support and customs lead, appropriate to the areas of responsibility with supporting effort from others, my question is there a better way of doing this in terms of coalescing those elements of the health, the defense infrastructure, the enforcement infrastructure into a mechanism? I do not know what that mechanism could be, but look to see what is the extant threat, what is the extant risk, and how can we realign resources and reorient resources to satisfy these demands as we go forward.
And following up on that, I would like to turn this question now to Mr. Colin John, in terms of not only from the government different agency, but from the private sector. How do you see the private sector having a role to play in working with law enforcement as we strive to address some of the law enforcement issues we have in the Caribbean? Mr. John?
Well, that's an excellent question, in that we have derived practical benefits from private sector incidents and grindings. During this COVID period, we had to set up the machineries at the stations where persons had to sanitize. We had to restructure some of the stations where we had to place some glass to prevent persons from interfacing directly police officers. And the private sector, they have assisted significantly in giving donations to the Royal Citizens and Grindings Police Force. They have also provided hand sanitizers, they have provided face masks. They have actually called us and asked us ways in which they can assist us. They have also cooperated with us in terms of policing it and asking, we're sponsoring several programs. The Royal Citizens and Grindings Police Force, we have a video out. The private sector, they sponsored that video. We have several jingles on the radio station encouraging persons to adhere to the health protocol. Again, the private sector, they assisted. So they are very cooperative, and I expect for them to be cooperative just the same way. I believe it's the same in other countries. So it's a joint partnership between the public and the private sector in tackling this pandemic situation.
Thank you very much. And now let me just move to Turks and Caicos in terms of the concern from most law enforcement officers is, do we have the right PPEs to conduct the responsibility that has been entrusted in us? How are the forces, or your force, or maybe other forces that you're familiar with, are they providing that level of safety and this level of protection to the officers that have to perform in, intertwining with the general public?
This was a really big question from the outset and continues to challenge us. when we started back in March, very little seemed to be known about the virus. So you had a lack of understanding whether it was airborne and just what PPE we actually needed. I mentioned in my introduction the challenges in procuring the right PPE. But what's been really helpful here is a very strong relationship with health to be really clear about the type of PPE and what actual PPE was needed for each individual role. So they've been enormously helpful to us here on the TCI, and we've talked them through various aspects of policing about what's required, whether it's a suit, face guards, masks and gloves. So we best understand the transmission of COVID and then how we can best defeat it. One of the things we weren't ready for was in the US, there was a block put on a lot of supplies, PPE related, out of the US. A federal block was put on. So masks, sanitizer, etc. There was a ban on exporting. So that was a challenge for us early on, which, given the US is a major supplier for us here on the Turks and Caicos Islands. So the advice from health was really critical. It was changing the habits of police officers as well, particularly around the sanitizing. So every officer was issued with personal sanitizer to use on duty. Colleagues have mentioned as well, we made adjustments to our police station and we dissuaded people from coming to the police stations without calling first. So we could do a lot more inquiries over the phone. We installed strict regime of entry into our police buildings. So which we saw as all part of the PPE, the protection of police officers as we challenged. One of the key things for us, we have an issue of protecting our borders with illegal migration. So that was a real challenge for our Marine branch and those from our colleagues from immigration when we intercepted a vessel at sea coming from predominantly Haiti, which we may have 100, 150 people on board, and we have no medical history. So it's important that we intercept those vessels for a number of reasons, particularly with COVID, to try and stem the flow of people into our communities here, of which we don't have any medical history of, particularly early on for us when the border was shut. So how do we best protect our Marine branch officers? So that was, health were really critical in that. And also the skill, perseverance and dedication of our Marine branch officers and also our immigration colleagues, who were the first point of contact for those people that were intercepted and detained. So it continues to be a challenge for us, but we've certainly settled now into a better understanding of COVID, a better understanding of how it's transmitted. The sanitization routines are now becoming the norm. We've got a new norm around entry and exit to our police buildings, and we have a much better now supply of PPE. So we're very confident going forward. And in fairness, I spoke earlier about the apprehension and nervousness from officers. There's definitely been a change now with a renewed confidence for officers in having access to PPE and also a better understanding of how the virus is transmitted. And the one thing, just closing, I would say is, which was also really important, is we had training for our officers from health around how to don PPE, how the PPE works, and most critically, when the PPE is no longer active. And the issue of masks is one that's very clear in there. And that was really useful, because to be issued PPE is one thing, to make sure you're using it effectively is another. And our staff took a lot from that and a lot more confidence when they're interacting with the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Dodd. I just, as we start winding down our final set of questions, I have a question for Stephen Kovner, and that has to do with capacity building, based on what Commissioner Button just said there, the need for capacity building as we go forward dealing with this pandemic. Let me ask you if you could just answer that for us quickly, as that would be our last question.
Thank you very much indeed. I think capacity building is one of those issues that we have to really focus on. And I think as we reevaluate, the reason I came back into policing, having left after 35 years, was because I believe in the concept of Interpol. 194 countries coming together with their experience, don't always agree, but know that law enforcement is what keeps the world a safer place. The Interpol has just established a virtual academy in which they're providing all member countries capacity building capabilities for free. The most recent course, we had 194 on from 130 countries. We need hundreds of thousands of officers on there. It's free for all member countries to use. We have a secure collaborative platform that allows officers to develop those capabilities, to develop those operational capabilities. Interpol is determined to make sure that we're more operationally relevant to those officers who are on the ground dealing with these difficult issues every day. We can do that through operational sharing of information. We can do it through the virtual academy and providing that leadership. But what we want to be able to do is provide those capabilities through the use of our 18 databases more effectively than ever, providing analysis and giving officers and staff the skills to get on and do the job effectively. Interpol's really relevant and got some really innovative things coming up that we want to share with the region and for you to test for us and give us feedback. So we hope that we'll be able to do that as effectively as possible, Commissioner Rodney.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much to the entire panel. I think we have maximized the time that we were allotted to. There's so much more we can do, but one of the things we take away is that there has been best practices in different forces, different agencies, and I think by just combining the different lessons learned, I think we can address the pandemic that has been brought to us. But we do not want to go into overtime because there's another panel coming up later with some high-profile personnel, and we do not want to keep them back. So at this time, I just want to express my gratitude to the panelists and also to the audience for contributing to this informative discussion. I would also like to express special thanks to my technical crew, both in Antigua and at CARICOM IMPACS, and all those who have made a significant contribution to this session. We say thank you. And I want to leave with this quotation from Henry Ford when he reminded us, he said, "Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success." So let us continue to participate in this very important conference put on by CARICOM IMPACS, because we are striving to keep our region safe and secure as we navigate the challenges of this global pandemic. So, ladies and gentlemen, we ask you to stay tuned for session 3, which is a conversation with CARICOM leaders on COVID-19 response and the way forward. Thank you, and see you very soon.
Thank you, Commissioner Rodney. You did us proud.
Thank you, Mr. Executive Director. And you can also say the last word as we come to an end of this session.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, and I'm not going to let it pass because certainly there was a lot of food for thought. Several points were taken by myself, particularly the points about leadership and partnership. Leadership in the sense of sense making for subordinates, visibility to create that sense of reassurance, continuation planning, especially for leadership continuity, the need to leverage technology more to keep up our engagement, particularly with the citizenry. But one of the points I want to somewhat bring everything together with, as Ray had opened the door, so to speak, about the question whether or not our institutions are still fit for purpose for the emergent threats and so on. And it brought to mind some of the work that we are doing with all and sundry. Reference was made before to the Interpol liaison office that is going to be established here very shortly. And that is also another resource tool other than the training platform that Steve mentioned, that essentially, instead of us having to go before to El Salvador or Argentina, we're going to have persons embedded here that will go around the region to find out essentially what are those key requirements from our member states that we can have more direct access to Interpol global resources to assist us. And I think also that the point needs to be made that this should not only be for police officials also. And I'll give an example again. In several of our member states, as in the case of Guyana, as Commissioner James is here, the Immigration Department falls within the police force, but this is a different situation in Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, and so on. But as we were invited to make better use of the databases, for example, the stolen lost travel document database is another that would be of pertinent use to the Immigration Department. All of you would be aware that this region is the first and the only one that uses the Advanced Passenger Information System as a collective body. So those independent states, we do this on a collaborative basis. So that whether it is a case that we are looking at merging some of our institutions, as St. Lucia is doing, to have a border force akin to CBP in the United States, certainly one of the lessons learned that is being already acted upon would be to bring those public health officials to become a more integral part of our border security architecture. Already an interface is being developed for those public health and customs officials that they can see the APIS data basically the same time that the police, immigration, and other forces are seeing it. And so again, you know, the whole thing that was permeating through the previous session and this one is the whole one of partnership. And like you said, once we stay together and work together in step, we will make progress in addressing these issues. So I just want to thank all of you again for a very informative session. Take care.
Thank you very much. It was our pleasure.